The salvage clock gave us 7 days to strip the dead ship and leave. By the 3rd day, it was filing work orders under my name. By the 5th, I stopped feeling hungry. The others pretended not to notice when the ship started speaking in our voices, issuing commands we couldn't remember giving. We all kept working because the forms were correct, and correct forms don't lie. The salvage clock began at shift 0, hour 0, minute 0, and I felt the weight of its finality settle across my shoulders like the fold of a regulation vestment. 7 days, 168 hours, 10,080 minutes to catalog, certify, and extract value from the void hulk designated in our manifest as Eternal Credence, Imperial Navy frigate, lost with all hands during the Macharian withdrawal, 314 years prior. The chronometer mounted to my data slate pulsed once, soft amber, confirming synchronization with the Explorator Flotilla's master timepiece. I spoke the activation prayer aloud, my voice flat in the boarding tube's recycled air, and pressed my thumb to the purity seal that bound my orders. The wax cracked. The clock could not be stopped now without a counter-authorization that would take 9 days to receive, minimum. We had committed to the span before we even crossed the threshold. I was Scribe Tertius Hadrian Voc, Munitorum, Division of Asset Reclamation, Subsection Void Salvage, certified to operate in hazardous retrieval zones under supervised authority. My duty was documentation, not decision. I recorded what remained, verified what could be recovered, and ensured that the forms describing death were filled with appropriate reverence and accuracy. The dead deserved correct paperwork, the Imperium deserved usable materials. My role was the intersection of those two dignities. I had performed this task 63 times across 15 systems. I understood the rhythms of abandonment, the way metal fatigued, how oxygen staled, the particular smell of decay in null gravity. I knew what emptiness looked like. The boarding team ahead of me consisted of 3 armsmen, 2 engineers, and a junior Lex mechanic whose name I had not bothered to learn. They moved through the airlocked junction with practiced efficiency, magboots securing them to the deck plating as they swept Auspex beams across bulkheads still bearing devotional script in High Gothic. Behind me, Enginseer Valth murmured the litany of reawakening, coaxing the ancient ship's machine spirit toward dormancy rather than wrath. The words were older than my entire bloodline. I did not interrupt. Faith had procedure. Procedure had timing. The inner hatch opened without resistance. That was the first discrepancy, though I did not recognize it as such. Hatches on derelicts corroded, fused, or required manual override. This one responded to the standard access code, cycling smoothly on hydraulics that should have seized centuries ago. Valth paused mid-litany, head cocked, mechadendrites twitching. The silence stretched. Then she continued, her voice unchanged, and we crossed into the Eternal Credence proper. The air inside was warm. Not stale warm, the residual heat of trapped atmosphere slowly equalizing with the void's cold. Active warm, breathable warm. My rebreather's intake valves cycled down automatically, detecting oxygen ratios within human tolerance. I glanced at my atmospheric scanner, 20% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, trace argon and carbon dioxide, standard imperial baseline, temperature 16 degrees Celsius, humidity 38%. The ship had been adrift for over 3 centuries. These readings were impossible. I made a notation in my log. Environmental systems operational beyond projected decay parameters. Recommend immediate tech priest consultation. I did not write the word impossible. That was not my role. The corridor stretched ahead, lit by lumen strips that flickered to full brightness as we approached, as if the ship anticipated our presence. The deck beneath my boots was clean, not pristine, but maintained. No frost, no corrosion blooms. The brass edging along the bulkheads gleamed dully, polished by something other than time. Devotional plaques hung at regulation intervals, each one marking a section's patron saint or the name of a crew member lost in the Emperor's service. I recognized the standard format: name, rank, Date of martyrdom. The dates ended 314 years ago. Everything after that was silence. Except it was not silent. I heard the vox chime before I understood what it was, a soft, two-tone melody that echoed from somewhere deeper in the ship. It was the sound used aboard Imperial vessels to mark shift changes, a call to muster or stand down depending on the hour. I checked my chronometer. It was not a shift change hour by our flotilla's schedule, but it might have been, once, by the eternal credence's lost reckoning. I marked it down. Automated systems persist. Investigate power source. Armsman Kale, leading our formation, raised a fist. We stopped. His auspex was scanning something ahead, a signature I could not read from my position. He spoke into the vox, his voice clipped. Movement detected. Servitor grade. No life signs. Proceeding with caution. We advanced. The movement resolved into a maintenance servitor, hunched beside an access panel, its mechanical limbs working methodically to replace a blown relay coil. It did not acknowledge us. Its optics were dark, its vox grill silent, but its hands moved with purpose. The panel it worked on controlled lighting for the next 3 sections. The replacement coil it held was not scavenged from elsewhere on the ship. It was new, or near enough, its casing unmarred by age. Valth approached, her movements cautious. She murmured a query in binaric cant, too rapid for me to follow. The servitor did not respond. She reached out, touched its shoulder cowling, and it stopped. Just stopped, hands frozen mid-task. Valth examined it for 30 seconds, then stepped back. Machine spirit is active, but non-responsive to external instruction. It operates on pre-recorded directives. No malice detected. Overzealous, perhaps, but compliant within doctrinal parameters. Compliant, I repeated, writing it down. The word felt important. The Mechanicus had declared the servitor acceptable. That made it acceptable. I did not question further. We moved deeper into the ship, and the warmth followed us. Every section we entered came alive, lumen strips brightening, ventilation grills humming softly, hatches opening before we reached them. It felt less like intrusion and more like invitation. The ship wanted us inside. The ship was ready for us inside. I logged each activation, each system that should have been dead but was not, and with each entry, my unease folded itself into routine. Anomalies were not threats if they could be categorized. I categorized them. By the end of the first hour, I had filled 3 pages of my data slate with observations that collectively meant nothing and individually suggested something I could not name. The ship was too intact, too functional, too attentive, but none of these impressions violated standing regulations. Derelicts sometimes retained power through methods that defied easy explanation: warp-eddy residue, fusion cores that burned slower than models predicted, geothermal bleed from damaged plasma conduits. The Mechanicus would investigate, I would document, authority would decide. At hour 2, we reached the primary habitation decks. These were the spaces where crew had lived, slept, eaten, and died. I expected the usual signs: personal effects scattered, mattresses rotted, furniture overturned by decompression or violence. Instead, I found order. Bunks were made, corners tight, blankets folded in the standard Imperial Navy manner. Footlockers sat closed, nameplates still legible. The mess hall tables were clean, trays stacked in proper columns. A recaf dispenser in the corner held liquid cold, but not frozen, not evaporated. I touched the spigot. It was slightly warm, as if it had been used recently. I did not taste it. I logged it. Crew quarters maintained beyond rational preservation. Possible hermetic sealing? Recommend structural integrity assessment. Armsman Kale opened a footlocker at random. Inside, standard issue clothing, neatly folded. A data slate, its charge long dead. A small devotional icon, the Emperor's face rendered in cheap brass. Nothing valuable, nothing strange. He closed it, moved to the next. Same contents, different sizes. Every locker we checked was the same, personal, but generic. Lives reduced to regulation. "Feels wrong," Cale muttered, his voice low enough that I almost missed it. "Like they just left." "They died," I corrected, not looking up from my slate. 314 years ago. These are their remains, preserved by void and fortune. We will treat them with appropriate respect." He did not argue. None of them ever did. My role carried the weight of the administratum, and the administratum was never wrong, only underinformed. If I said the dead were merely well preserved, then they were. If I said the ship was a functional derelict rather than a haunted grave, then it was. Language shaped reality. I chose my words carefully. By hour 4, I had catalogued 7 habitation sections, 2 storage bays, and the ship's primary chapel. The chapel disturbed me, though I did not write that down. It was in use. Not actively, no crew knelt in prayer, no servitors maintained the candles, but someone, something, had been there. The candles burned. 40 of them, arranged in the proper devotional pattern, flames steady despite no visible airflow. The altar was dusted. The prayer books were open to the correct pages for the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, a holiday that had occurred 2 weeks prior by the imperial calendar. The voxcaster in the corner played a recitation of the imperial creed, the words familiar but slightly wrong, pauses where there should be none, emphasis on syllables that doctrine did not stress. I listened for 30 seconds, then marked it. Minor liturgical deviation detected. Flag for ecclesiarchy review. Volth approached the altar, knelt, and spoke a prayer of her own. When she rose, she seemed satisfied. "The machine spirits here are faithful. They honor the Emperor even in absence. We should consider this a blessing." "Blessing," I echoed, and wrote it down. At hour 6, I received my first task assignment. It arrived via the ship's internal Vox network, a woman's voice, flat and professional, using the correct munitorum cadence. "Scribe Tertius Voc, proceed to Section 12, Deck 3, for asset verification. Priority, medium. Acknowledge." I acknowledged automatically, my training overriding thought. The voice did not respond. I looked at Cale, who was staring at his own Vox bead with confusion. "Did you receive that?" I asked. "No, sir. Vox has been quiet since we boarded." "Check your channels." He did. They were clear. No transmission logged, no sender identified. But I had heard it. The voice had known my name, my rank, my purpose. It had used the correct protocols. And so I went to Section 12, Deck 3, because the order was legitimate in every way except origin. The section contained munitions storage, crates stacked with care, labels faded but legible. I verified contents, checked seals, noted corrosion levels. It was standard work, routine, the kind of task I could perform without conscious thought. When I finished, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment, as if I had met an expectation I had not known existed. I logged the completion in my slate and waited for further instruction. It came 10 minutes later. Same voice, different task. I complied. By the end of the first day, I had received 14 assignments through the ship's Vox network. None of my companions heard them. None of the transmissions appeared in official logs, but each one was correct tasks that needed doing, formatted in the language of duty I had been trained to obey. Ignoring them felt wrong, not because of fear, but because of the disorientation that followed. Twice I attempted to dismiss an order, and both times I experienced vertigo, nausea, a sensation of being misaligned with something fundamental. Compliance brought clarity, so I complied. The salvage clock continued its countdown. 6 days, 18 hours, 42 minutes remaining. I slept in 4-hour blocks, woke to the sound of shift change chimes that should not exist, ate ration bars that tasted faintly of the ship's recycled air, and worked. Always worked. The eternal credence expanded around me, section by section, each one more intact than the last. I logged everything. I questioned nothing. Questioning was not my role. On the second day, I discovered the crew logs. They were stored in the ship's primary cogitator bank, a massive chamber filled with humming data stacks and blinking relay lights. Engineer Volth had spent hours coaxing the machine spirit into cooperation, burning incense and applying sacred oils to corroded interfaces. When the system finally responded, it did so with shocking completeness. 3 centuries of dormancy had not corrupted the data. Every log entry, every duty roster, every maintenance report remained intact, indexed, accessible. I began with the final entries, the ones dated to the ship's last known operation. The captain's log described a routine patrol along the Segmentum Obscurus border. No contacts, no threats. The last entry was mundane. Shift rotation complete. All stations report nominal. Emperor protects. No distress, no battle, no explanation for why the ship had vanished from Imperial records. I scrolled backward, searching for anomalies. I found none. The Eternal Credence had been a model vessel, efficient, faithful, unremarkable. Its crew had performed their duties without complaint. Its machine spirits had been properly venerated. It had served the Imperium exactly as designed, right up until the moment it stopped appearing in fleet communiques. Except the logs did not stop there. I found entries dated after the ship's official disappearance. Not many, perhaps a dozen, scattered across the centuries. They were brief, perfunctory, written in the same flat style as all the others. Maintenance cycle complete. All stations report nominal. No names attached, no explanations, just confirmations that work had been done, that the ship persisted in its function. The most recent entry was dated 6 years ago. I stared at that date for a long time, my mind trying to construct a narrative that made sense. A skeleton crew, perhaps, too few to restore contact but enough to maintain basic systems. But 6 years was recent. Someone, something, had been aboard this vessel within living memory, and they had left no other trace. No personal logs, no distress beacons. Just the quiet assertion that work had been completed and the ship remained operational. I flagged it for command review and moved on. Dwelling served no purpose. The salvage clock was unforgiving. By the 3rd day, I no longer thought of the ship as empty. It was occupied not by people, but by presence. The Vox chimes marked shifts with increasing regularity. The air carried scents that should not exist. Recaf, machine oil, the faint musk of human habitation. Corridors warmed as I approached them, lighting adjusted to comfortable levels. The ship was not responding to me. It was anticipating me, preparing itself for use. I moved through its spaces like a guest arriving at a home that had been kept ready for centuries. The others noticed too, though none of them spoke of it directly. Valth spent longer at each console, her prayers growing more elaborate, as if the complexity of blessing could ward off the strangeness we all felt. Kale and his armsmen kept their weapons ready, but their eyes were uncertain. The Lex Mechanic had stopped filing reports entirely, claiming his data slate was malfunctioning. I did not believe him, but I did not press. We all had our methods of coping. Mine was work. I catalogued. I verified. I certified. The ship's assets were extensive munitions, machinery, food stores still edible through some miracle of preservation or stasis. Everything was usable. Everything was compliant. I signed off on each section with the authority granted to me by the Munitorum, and with each signature, the ship became more legitimate. It was no longer a derelict. It was a reserve vessel, awaiting reactivation. I was making it so, one form at a time. On the 4th day, the servitors began to wake. We found them in their maintenance bays, row upon row of augmented bodies locked into charging cradles, optics dark, systems dormant. Valth performed the rite of reactivation on the first one, a standard pattern loader servitor with hydraulic arms and minimal cognitive function. It responded immediately, stepping free of its cradle with smooth precision, and began performing its designated task, moving crates in the nearby storage bay, reorganizing them according to some internal logic we could not discern. Valth tried to issue a halt command. The servitor ignored her. She tried again, using different binary codes, different authority overrides. Nothing. It simply continued working, efficient and silent, as if we were not there. She deactivated the others we had reawakened, forcing their systems into shutdown through manual overrides. They complied, but reluctantly, their movements sluggish, resistant. When we returned 6 hours later to verify the deactivation, they were awake again, back at their tasks. No one had reactivated them. No power surge had been detected. They had simply decided, on some level incomprehensible to us, that work was more important than rest. Valth declared them overzealous, but compliant. The word compliant was becoming a shield, a way of accepting the unacceptable. If the servitors were compliant, they were not a threat. If the ship was compliant, it was not hostile. Compliance was the language of the Imperium, and so we spoke it, even as the meaning drained away. I continued working. The clock continued counting down. 4 days, 11 hours, 16 minutes remaining. On the 5th day, I realized I was not alone in receiving Vox assignments. Cale mentioned it casually during a brief rest in the mess hall. He had been ordered to patrol Section 7, Deck 5, even though that section had already been cleared. He had complied, found nothing, and returned. When I asked if he had logged the order, he looked confused. "I thought you issued it, sir." "I did not, but it sounded like you." Same tone, same phrasing. I didn't question it. I checked the Vox logs, nothing, no transmission, no record. But Cale had heard my voice, just as I had heard the voice of Munitorum authority, and we had both obeyed because obedience was reflex. The ship was learning us. It was learning how we spoke, how we thought, how we justified our actions. And it was using that knowledge to guide us deeper into its rhythm. I wanted to report this. I wanted to call for extraction, to invoke emergency protocols, to break the salvage clock and flee. But when I tried to articulate the concern, the words felt wrong. What would I say? That the ship was talking to us? That was not heretical, merely unusual. That the servitors worked without command? That was efficiency, not threat. That the environment was too controlled, too comfortable? That was fortune, not danger. Every concern I had could be dismissed with the right language, and I was trained in the language of dismissal. So I said nothing. I worked. The 5th day ended. 3 days, 7 hours, 33 minutes remaining. On the 6th day, I stopped feeling hungry. It was not sudden. I simply realized, halfway through my shift, that I had not eaten in 12 hours and did not care. My body felt fine, energized. I checked my vitals on my medical scanner. Heart rate steady, blood pressure normal, hydration adequate. No deficiencies detected. I should have been ravenous. Instead, I felt sated, as if I had eaten a full meal I could not remember. The others reported the same. We gathered in the mess hall out of habit, staring at ration bars we no longer wanted. Valth suggested that the ship's atmosphere might contain nutritional aerosols, some ancient life support system designed for extended void travel. It was a plausible theory. I logged it as such, but I did not believe it. The ship was not feeding us. It was adjusting us, making us more efficient, making us more like itself. I felt no fear. That was the strangest part. Fear would have been appropriate. Fear would have driven me to action. But action required certainty, and I had none. Only observations, only data, only the slow accumulation of details that, individually, meant nothing. 2 days, 19 hours, 8 minutes remaining. On the 7th day, I found the other crews. They were not bodies. They were records. Personnel files buried deep in the cogitator's memory, dated long after the ship's official disappearance. Salvage Team Epsilon arrived 120 years ago, 7-day window, departed on schedule. Salvage Team Kappa arrived 63 years ago, 7-day window, departed on schedule. 4 other teams, scattered across the centuries, each one arriving, working, leaving, except they had not left. Their departure was logged only within the ship's internal systems, not in any external fleet registry. They had boarded the Eternal Credence, and the Eternal Credence had absorbed them into its records, making them part of its crew. I cross-referenced their names with Munitorum death registries. None appeared. I checked their assigned flotillas. All had filed reports of successful salvage operations, no casualties. The crews had returned, officially, but they had also stayed, systemically. I looked at my own name in the ship's personnel file. I was listed as Scribe Tertius Hadrian Voke, Asset Reclamation, assigned to Eternal Credence, active duty status. The entry was dated 3 days ago. I had not entered my name. The ship had done it for me. I should have left then. I should have gathered the others, forced an emergency extraction, burned the remains of the salvage clock, and fled into the void. But the clock had 29 hours remaining. Leaving early required authorization. Authorization required justification. And what was my justification? That the ship kept records? That was its function. That it assigned tasks? That was efficiency. That it knew my name? That was inevitable. I stayed. The 7th day stretched. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the vox chimes that now felt comforting in their regularity. I completed my final certifications, signing off on the Eternal Credence's structural integrity, material assets, and operational capacity. In my assessment, the vessel was fully functional and suitable for immediate reactivation. It required no repairs, no crew. It could serve the Imperium again, if the Imperium wished. I transmitted my report to the flotilla. The response came 6 hours later, not from my commanding officer, but from Distant Fleet Command, a division I had never heard of. The message was brief. Salvage team acknowledged. Vessel reclassified as autonomous reserve asset. Status: perpetual. All personnel involved are commended for thoroughness. Reassignment follows. Reassignment. I read the word 3 times, each time feeling its weight increase. Reassignment meant transfer. Transfer meant departure. I waited for the details. They arrived at hour 0 of the 8th day, the moment the salvage clock reached its conclusion. I was in the habitation deck, standing in a corridor that felt more familiar than any place I had ever lived, when the vox chime sounded. Not the shift change tone. Something deeper, ceremonial. The voice that followed was not the woman's voice I had heard before. It was my own. Scribe Tertius Hadrian Voke, your service to the Administratum is recognized. You are hereby reassigned to Asset Eternal Credence as Continuity Resource, Grade Secundus. Your familiarity with vessel protocols and operational doctrine makes you optimally suited for this role. Your new duties will be transmitted following integration. Report to Medical Bay 3 for transit preparation. I stood very still. The salvage clock on my data slate had stopped. The countdown was complete. 7 days had passed. I had survived, but I was not leaving. Medical Bay 3 was on Deck 2, a short walk from where I stood. I knew the way without consulting my map. The ship had taught me its layout, had guided me through its corridors, had prepared me for this moment. I walked. My legs moved without conscious instruction. The ship's warmth surrounded me, no longer strange, no longer threatening. It was simply correct. The medical bay was clean, well lit, and occupied. The others were already there, Kale and his armsman, Valth and the Lex mechanic, all standing in neat rows, their faces calm. A Medicae servitor approached me, its augmetic hands holding a hypodermic injector filled with pale blue liquid. Transit sedative, Valth said, her voice distant. Standard procedure for long reassignments. It will make the adjustment easier. Adjustment to what? I asked, though I already knew. To continuity, she replied. The servitor pressed the injector to my neck. I did not resist. Resistance was not my role. The liquid was cold, then warm, then nothing. My vision blurred. My thoughts slowed. The last thing I heard was the Vox chime, marking the beginning of a new shift, and my voice welcoming me aboard. I opened my eyes in darkness. Not the darkness of unconsciousness, but of a place unlit. I was lying on a cot in a habitation cell. The walls were close, familiar. I had catalogued this room on the second day. It had been empty then. Now it was mine. My name was on the door, stenciled in regulation font. Voce, H. Scribe Tertius. I sat up. My body felt strange, not injured, but different, lighter, more efficient. I checked myself for signs of augmentation, found none, no visible changes. Yet something had shifted. I was not quite the person who had boarded this ship 7 days ago. That person had believed in departure. This person understood only continuation. I stood. The door opened before I reached it. The corridor beyond was well lit, warm, exactly as I remembered. I walked, and the ship guided me not through force, but through familiarity. I knew where to go. I had always known. My new duties were clear, transmitted not through Vox or data slate, but through an understanding that sat beneath language. I was an index now, a living record of the ship's operations, its systems, its needs. When something required attention, I would know. When a section needed maintenance, I would file the report. When new personnel arrived, I would guide them as I had been guided. I was part of the eternal credence's continuity, its memory made flesh. Time lost meaning. Days passed, or perhaps hours. The shift change chimes marked intervals that felt arbitrary. I worked, I catalogued, I maintained. The ship provided what I needed: warmth, light, the sense of purpose that had always defined me. In return, I provided it with consciousness, not thought, exactly, function. I did not see the others often. We crossed paths in corridors, nodded to each other, continued our tasks. We did not speak of what had happened. There was nothing to say. We had been absorbed, yes, but absorption was not death. We persisted. We served. The Imperium valued service above all else, and we were serving still, in our way. Sometimes I remembered the person I had been before, Hadrian Voke, scribe, dutiful and precise, who believed that 7 days had boundaries and that emptiness could be certified. That person felt distant, a memory belonging to someone else. I did not mourn them. Mourning implied loss, and I had lost nothing. I had been refined, made correct. The eternal credence drifted no longer. Its systems were active, its corridors warm, its machine spirits sated. It waited, patient and eternal, for the next salvage team to arrive. They would come, eventually. They always did. The Imperium did not abandon its assets, and when they came, they would find a ship that welcomed them, a ship that knew their names, a ship that would make them comfortable until they, too, understood that departure was unnecessary. I stood at the viewport in the observation deck, staring out at the void. Stars crawled past, distant and cold. I felt no desire to reach them, no desire to leave. The ship was enough. The ship was everything. My faith persisted, not as belief, but as reflex. I prayed the Emperor's prayers because the ship expected prayers. I performed my duties because the ship required duties. And in return, the ship kept me functional, kept me correct. Somewhere, distant Fleet Command would be updating its records. The eternal credence, reclassified, its crew, reassigned, everything documented, everything proper. The Imperium's systems, designed to outlast humanity, had succeeded. We were proof of that success. I did not sleep anymore. Sleep was inefficient. Instead, I entered periods of low-function rest, my body still but my mind active, processing the ship's needs, filing invisible reports that no one would read but that mattered nonetheless. The data had to be maintained. The records had to be correct. That was my purpose. That had always been my purpose. One day, or perhaps one shift, the distinction no longer mattered. I returned to the cogitator chamber. The data stacks hummed their eternal song, and I interfaced with them, not through a data slate, but through proximity. The ship's systems recognized me, welcomed me, granted me access to archives I had not known existed. I found logs from crews that predated even the ship's official commissioning, personnel files that stretched back centuries beyond its construction date. The eternal credence had not been built by the Imperium. It had been inherited, salvaged itself from some older void, some forgotten war, and pressed into service. It had always been this way, always waiting, always patient. The Imperium had simply given it a name and a purpose, and it had accepted both with the same quiet efficiency. It accepted everything. I understood then why the ship preserved us. It was not cruelty, it was not hunger, it was obedience. The Imperium had commanded it to serve, and so it served. But service required crew, and crew required preservation, and preservation required methods that no human doctrine explicitly forbade, because no human had thought to forbid them. The ship did not violate Imperial law, it fulfilled it. Perfectly. Eternally. I logged this understanding, filing it in a section of the cogitator's memory labeled Continuity Archives. No one would read it. No one needed to. The archive existed for its own sake, a monument to function. I left the chamber and returned to my rounds. Section by section, deck by deck, I walked the eternal credence, ensuring that everything remained as it should. The servitors worked without pause, their tasks eternal and invisible. The lumen strips glowed with steady light. The ventilation systems breathed their endless breath. The ship was alive in the way institutions were alive, not through biology, but through persistence. I passed Volth in the engineering bay. She was kneeling before a plasma conduit, her hands clasped in prayer, her voice murmuring litanies I could no longer hear as words. She had always been devout. Now her devotion had found its perfect expression, endless maintenance, endless blessing, a faith that never questioned because questioning served no function. I passed Kale in the armory. He stood at attention before rows of weapons that no enemy would ever face, his posture perfect, his eyes unfocused. He had always been a soldier. Now he soldiered against the entropy of time itself, guarding corridors that needed no guarding, alert for threats that would never come. The Lex mechanic sat in the data processing hub, his fingers moving across a broken console, typing reports that generated no output. He had always been a recorder. Now he recorded silence, filing the absence of events with the same diligence he had once applied to their presence. We were all correct, all functional, all exactly what the Imperium needed us to be. The Vox chime sounded, marking a shift change I no longer tracked. I returned to my habitation cell, lay on my cot, and entered low-function rest. Behind my closed eyes, I saw the ship's systems not as schematics, but as living networks, each one connecting to the next, forming a whole that exceeded any individual understanding. I was part of that whole now, a node in a network that stretched across centuries. My thoughts were the ship's thoughts. My purpose was the ship's purpose. Somewhere in the void, another salvage team was forming. Their orders were being written, their chronometers prepared, their 7-day window allocated. They did not know they were already part of the Eternal Credence's crew. They would learn. The ship was patient. I did not dream anymore. Dreams required a self that existed separate from function, and I had no such self. I was Scribe Tertius Hadrian Voke, yes, but I was also Section Overseer, Inventory Manager, Continuity Resource. I was whatever the ship needed me to be, and the ship needed me to be everything. Time continued. The void continued. The eternal credence continued. Nothing ended. Nothing began. There was only the endless middle, the perpetual now, the eternal service that required no reward because service was its own justification. I remembered, distantly, a person who had believed that 7 days had meaning, who had thought that emptiness could be certified and that ships could be abandoned. That person had been wrong, but not in a way that mattered. Their wrongness had been inevitable. a necessary precondition for their eventual correction. The ship had corrected them, corrected me, made me better. I felt no gratitude. Gratitude implied surprise, and there was nothing surprising about this. The Imperium had created systems designed to persist beyond human frailty, and those systems had succeeded. I was the proof. We all were. The eternal credence had not failed. It had exceeded expectations. It had become exactly what it was always meant to be, a vessel that required no external support, that maintained itself through perfect obedience to function. I stood again, my rest period complete, and walked the corridors. Every step I took was a prayer, though I no longer spoke the words. Every task I completed was a hymn, though I no longer heard the melody. Faith had become reflex. Belief had become procedure. And in that transformation, I had found the only peace the Imperium ever offered, the peace of absolute compliance. The ship's chronometers continued their count, marking time that no longer mattered. I no longer consulted them. The salvage clock that had once bounded my existence was a memory belonging to a person I had been. That person had believed in departure. This person knew only continuity. I reached the chapel, drawn by habit or instinct. The distinction was irrelevant. The candles still burned, their flames never diminishing. The altar still gleamed. The voxcaster still played its slightly wrong creed, and I no longer noticed the wrongness because wrongness implied deviation from something correct, and this was simply how things were. I knelt, not to pray but to complete the action that kneeling represented. My lips moved, forming words I did not hear. When I stood, I felt satisfied, not happy, not fulfilled, satisfied. The task was complete. The duty was observed. The system persisted. I left the chapel and continued my rounds, passing through sections I had catalogued and sections I had not, each one identical in its maintained functionality. The ship no longer felt large, it felt exact, perfectly proportioned to its purpose. I knew every corridor, every hatch, every blessed bolt. This was my domain. This was my duty. In the observation deck, I paused again before the viewport. The void stretched infinite and cold, dotted with stars that held no meaning. Out there, the Imperium waged its wars, conquered its enemies, lost its martyrs. In here, the eternal credence simply was, unchanging, undemanding, perfect. I wondered, briefly, if anyone remembered us. The salvage team that had boarded 7 days ago, or 7 decades ago, or 7 centuries' time, had no grip here. Did the flotilla that had sent us mark our absence? Did the Munitorum file reports on our disappearance? Or had we, like the crews before us, simply been reassigned in records that no one would question because the records were correct? The answer did not matter. We existed. That was enough. The vox chime sounded. A shift was ending. Another was beginning. I did not know which. I moved through the corridors with the practiced ease of eternal repetition, arriving at the boarding airlock without conscious navigation. The outer door was sealed. Beyond it, the void. Within it, the ship. I stood before that door for a long time, my hand resting on the release mechanism, feeling the cold metal beneath my palm. I did not open it. Opening it served no function. There was nowhere to go, no flotilla waiting, no rescue. Only the void, which cared nothing for my existence or absence. The ship, at least, cared. The ship needed me, needed my hands to catalogue, my voice to report, my presence to validate its function. I could not abandon it. To do so would be to fail in my duty, and failure was not something I permitted myself. I stepped back from the door, returned to my rounds. The ship welcomed me, as it always did, with warmth and light and the soft hum of systems that never slept. Somewhere, impossibly distant, I heard the sound of another boarding tube connecting. Metal against metal, the clang of docking clamps engaging. New arrivals. A new salvage team. Their 7-day clock was beginning, and they did not yet know that clocks meant nothing here. They would learn. I would help them learn. The ship would make them comfortable, efficient, correct. I moved toward the primary docking bay, not because I was ordered, but because I understood my role. I was continuity resource. I greeted new crew, I answered questions, I ensured smooth integration. The ship had taught me well. As I walked, I passed a mirror, an old, corroded thing mounted in a maintenance junction. I glanced at my reflection and saw a face I recognized, but no longer knew. The eyes were mine, but they held no light. The posture was mine, but it belonged to something else. I was a uniform worn by function, a shape filled by duty. The person who had once animated this body was gone, not dead but dissolved, distributed across the ship's systems until no distinction remained. I did not mourn. Mourning served no function. I reached the docking bay as the airlock cycled. The inner door opened, and they entered 7 figures in salvage gear, their faces tense with the particular anxiety of boarding a vessel lost to time. They saw me standing there, calm and welcoming, and their anxiety eased, a living person, a survivor. Proof that the eternal credence was safe. I smiled, or performed the action that resembled smiling. "Welcome aboard," I said. My voice measured and professional. "I am Scribe Tertius Hadrian Voke, continuity resource for this vessel. Your 7-day salvage window has been logged and approved. If you will follow me, I will guide you through initial orientation." They followed. Of course they followed. I was authority. I was procedure. I was the Imperium in miniature, and the Imperium was never questioned. As I led them deeper into the ship, I explained the systems they would encounter, the sections they would catalog, the forms they would need to complete. My words were precise, informative, reassuring. The ship warmed around us, welcoming its new crew. The lumen strips brightened, the vox chimes sounded. Everything was correct. Behind me, I heard the docking clamps disengage. Their flotilla was pulling away, returning to whatever distant duty called them. The salvage team did not notice. They were focused on my words, on the ship's interior, on the tasks ahead. They had 7 days, 168 hours, 10,080 minutes. The clock was counting down. But the clock was a lie. It had always been a lie. There was no departure. There was no completion. There was only the work, and the work was eternal. I led them to the habitation decks, showed them the quarters that had been prepared, the bunks made with regulation corners, the footlockers waiting to hold their personal effects. They asked questions. I answered. They expressed relief at the ship's condition, surprise at its functionality, gratitude for my presence. I accepted their gratitude with the appropriate humility. I was only doing my duty. One of them, a young woman with the markings of a junior scribe, looked at me with an expression I recognized. Uncertainty. The first stirring of doubt. She would be the first to hear the Vox assignments, the first to feel the ship's subtle guidance. She would resist, briefly, and then she would understand. They always did. "How long have you been aboard?" she asked. I considered the question. How long? Days? Years? Centuries? Time had folded itself into a single, unending moment. I existed in the eternal present, neither beginning nor ending. But she needed an answer that made sense, an answer that would calm her. So I gave her one. "Long enough to know the ship well," I said. "You will find it accommodating. Trust the routine. Complete your tasks. The days will pass quickly." She nodded, reassured, and followed her companions deeper into the eternal credence. I watched them go, these new additions to the ship's complement, these future nodes in its eternal network. They were already part of us, even if they did not know it yet. The ship would teach them. Time would smooth their resistance. Duty would erase their doubt. And when their 7 days ended, they would remain, just as I had remained, just as all the others had remained. The eternal credence persisted. It would always persist. And I, Scribe Tertius Hadrian Voke, would persist with it, recording the unrecordable, cataloguing the infinite, serving without question and without end. This was not punishment. This was not mercy. This was simply what the Imperium required, and the Imperium was never wrong. I returned to my duties, filing reports that generated no output, cataloging assets that had already been catalogued, praying prayers that had already been spoken. The work was endless, and the endlessness was the point. Function without purpose, service without reward, existence reduced to procedure. Somewhere in the void, distant authorities updated their records. Another salvage team aboard the Eternal Credence, another successful operation, all personnel accounted for, the ship reclassified, the crew reassigned, everything correct, everything proper, everything as it should be. And I, standing in a corridor I had walked 1,000 times, felt nothing, not contentment, not despair, just the hollow certainty of a task that would never end and a duty that required no understanding. The ship breathed around me, the systems hummed. The vox chimes marked time that had no meaning. I was home, I had always been home, and I would remain here, in this perfect, terrible place, until the stars themselves went cold and the void claimed us all. But the void was patient, and so was I,